The Abduction. The fireflies danced like tiny stars against the velvet curtain of night, their gentle light a stark contrast to the harsh memories that sometimes haunted Tom Harvey's dreams. He sat in his weathered rocking chair, letting the smooth motion soothe away the tension that still occasionally gripped his shoulders, a remnant of a life he'd left behind decades ago. Beside him, Julia's knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on a blanket for their youngest grandchild, her movements as precise and measured as they had been in another lifetime, when those hands had served very different purposes. "Remember when we first bought this place?" Tom asked, taking a sip of his lemonade. The ice clinked against the glass, a sound as familiar as breathing after 15 years of retirement. The farmhouse had been their sanctuary, their chance at redemption after years of living in the shadows. Julia's lips curved into a smile, though her eyes never left her knitting. "The realtor thought we were crazy. Two retirees wanting a property this isolated." Her fingers never stopped moving, the yarn taking shape beneath her careful attention. "Little did she know that was exactly what we needed." The cricket symphony filled the comfortable silence between them, a natural chorus that had replaced the sound of gunfire and explosions in their lives. Their porch overlooked rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon, darkness settling over the landscape like a comfortable blanket. It was the kind of peace they had never thought possible during their operative days. Tom's eyes drifted to the small scar on Julia's left hand, barely visible in the porch light. Prague, 1985. The mission that had changed everything. He remembered the blood, the snow, the way Julia had never flinched even as she stitched her own wound closed in their safe house afterward. That night, they had made the decision to leave it all behind. "Do you hear that?" Julia's voice cut through his reminiscence, her tone carrying an edge he hadn't heard in years. Her knitting needles had stopped their rhythmic movement. Tom set his glass down, every nerve suddenly alert. Years of training kicked in automatically, his senses expanding to catalog his surroundings. The crickets had fallen silent. The fireflies, which had been abundant moments ago, had vanished. A low, almost subsonic hum vibrated through the floorboards beneath their feet. "Julia," Tom said quietly, his hand moving toward the walking cane propped against his chair. It looked like a simple mobility aid, but the core was reinforced titanium, a precaution from a life they couldn't completely leave behind. "Code Sigma." "Confirmed," she replied, her knitting now carefully set aside. Her eyes scanned the darkness, picking out details most people would miss. Multiple points of contact. Unusual pattern. The hum grew stronger, and the air took on a strange electric quality that made the hair on their arms stand up. Tom's fingers had just wrapped around his cane when the first beam of light pierced the darkness from above, a pale blue radiance that seemed to defy physics itself. "Not our usual visitors," Julia observed dryly, her hand slipping beneath her knitting basket where Tom knew she kept a ceramic blade that would never show up on metal detectors. Before either of them could move, the light intensified exponentially, becoming a solid column that enveloped them both. Tom felt his feet leave the porch, the sensation of weightlessness both familiar and alien at the same time. He'd done halo jumps that felt similar, but this was different. This was wrong. Julia's hand found his in the blinding light, her grip firm and steady. As their modest farmhouse shrank beneath them, disappearing into the distance like a child's toy, Tom squeezed her fingers in their old signal, ready for anything. When the light finally faded, they found themselves in what could only be described as a chamber, though unlike any they had encountered in their extensive experience. The walls pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, and the air carried a metallic taste that reminded Tom of ozone after a lightning strike. They were no longer alone. The beings that stood before them were tall, easily 7 feet in height, with elongated heads and skin that seemed to shift colors like oil on water. Their eyes were entirely black, reflecting Tom and Julia's images like dark mirrors. Subjects acquired, one of them spoke, the words somehow clear in their minds despite not being in any human language. Proceeding with protocol harvest. Tom felt Julia's hand tighten almost imperceptibly in his. To anyone else, she would have appeared frightened, an elderly woman far out of her depth. But Tom knew better. He recognized the slight tension in her jaw, the careful way she was shifting her weight. She was calculating angles, assessing threats, planning contingencies. Just like the old days. "What do you want?" Tom demanded, playing his role as the protective husband. Let them think he was the one to watch. It had always worked to their advantage when people underestimated Julia. The alien that seemed to be in charge stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth. "You are specimens of interest. Your species has shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. We seek to understand these qualities. By kidnapping elderly couples from their homes." Tom's voice carried just the right amount of indignation and fear. "We're hardly representative specimens." The alien's head tilted slightly, an unsettlingly human gesture. "Age is irrelevant to our research. We require subjects from all life stages." It raised what appeared to be some sort of device, which emitted a soft purple glow. "Separation is required for preliminary testing." Tom felt the force before he saw anything change. It was like being caught in a current, pulling him away from Julia. Their hands were forced apart, and a transparent barrier materialized between them, slowly becoming opaque. "Tom!" Julia called out, her voice carrying a tremor that only he would recognize as completely manufactured. "Please, don't hurt him." The last thing Tom saw before the barrier became completely solid was Julia's eyes meeting his. In that fraction of a second, decades of partnership and silent communication passed between them. They had been in worse situations. They had survived things that should have killed them. And they had never failed a mission. As Tom was led away by two of the aliens, he allowed himself to appear slightly unsteady on his feet, playing up his age. "You're making a mistake," he told them, letting his voice shake. "We're just retired farmers." The alien studying him made a sound that might have been amusement. "Your primitive attempts at deception are unnecessary. You will be processed according to protocol, regardless of your cooperation." In his separate chamber, Tom was secured to what appeared to be an examination table, though it seemed to be partially alive, adjusting to his form like a liquid before solidifying. The restraints were unlike anything he had encountered in his years of service, no visible locks or mechanisms to manipulate. As various devices were positioned around him, humming with unknown energy, Tom closed his eyes and began counting. He and Julia had developed their timing years ago, perfected it through dozens of operations. If they were following their usual pattern, he estimated he had about 3 minutes before things got interesting. The aliens moved around him with clinical efficiency, taking readings and speaking in their strange language that somehow translated directly into his mind. They clearly believed they were in complete control of the situation. Tom almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The resistance. Julia Harvey had been in worse situations. Budapest in '82. Caracas in '89. The incident in Dubai that was still classified. But as she sat in the alien examination chamber, watching her captors prepare their mysterious instruments, she had to admit this was certainly the most unusual predicament she'd faced. The chamber walls pulsed with an organic light that reminded her of deep-sea creatures she'd once observed during an undercover operation on a research vessel. The air carried a metallic tang that made her think of weapon-grade plutonium, though the Geiger counter embedded in her wedding ring remained silent. Some habits died hard, and paranoia had kept them alive too many times to ignore. 3 aliens attended her, their movements precise and coordinated. They seemed to assume her calm demeanor was shock or resignation. They hadn't bothered to restrain her beyond the initial force field that kept her seated in what appeared to be a living chair, its surface constantly shifting beneath her like mercury. "Fascinating," one of them said, its thoughts translating directly into her mind. "The cellular degradation rate is significantly lower than expected for a specimen of this age." Julia suppressed a smile. The experimental anti-aging treatments they'd received during their service had been cutting edge in the 80s. Apparently, they worked better than even their creators had anticipated. The neural activity is unusual as well, another alien noted, holding up a device that projected holographic representations of what she assumed was her brain activity. The pattern suggests extensive cognitive conditioning. The third alien, slightly smaller than the others but carrying itself with clear authority, approached her directly. "You show remarkable composure for a primitive being facing superior life forms," it said, its black eyes studying her with what might have been curiosity. Julia met its gaze steadily. "I watch a lot of science fiction movies," she replied mildly. "Though I have to say, your hospitality leaves something to be desired." The alien's head tilted, reminding her eerily of an owl. Humor as a stress response. Typical. It raised a device that emitted a soft purple glow. "This will allow us to access your neural pathways directly. Resistance is not advised." "Before we begin," Julia said, her voice taking on the tone she'd once used to negotiate with warlords and dictators, "I have a question. The others you've taken, what happened to them?" The alien paused, its iridescent skin shifting colors slightly. "They served their purpose. Their genetic material and neural patterns have been harvested and catalogued. Their physical forms were recycled." "I see." Julia nodded slowly. "And how many have there been?" "You are subjects 1247 and 1248 of the current harvest cycle," the alien replied. "Your species' diversity requires a significant sample size for accurate analysis." Julia did some quick mental math. If they were taking people in pairs, that meant over 600 couples had disappeared without a trace. The implications were staggering. "And how long has this been going on?" "The harvest protocol has been active for approximately 50 of your Earth years," the alien said, seemingly unbothered by her questions. "Your species' primitive investigation methods have failed to detect our presence." Julia thought about all the unsolved missing persons cases she'd reviewed during her years of service. How many of them had ended up in chambers like this one? How many families were still waiting for answers that would never come? The alien raised its device again. "Enough questions. We will begin the neural extraction process." Julia smiled, and for the first time, there was nothing mild about it. "I'm afraid I have to disagree." The alien's skin rippled with what might have been confusion. "Your agreement is not required." "No," Julia said, her voice now carrying an edge of steel, "but your mistake was in assuming that questions were all I was asking." She glanced at the holographic display of her neural patterns. "Tell me, in all your studies of humans, did you ever encounter any who were trained in neural feedback loops?" Before the alien could respond, the holographic display erupted in a cascade of chaotic patterns. The device in the alien's hand began to emit a high-pitched whine, its purple glow intensifying to a brilliant white. "Impossible," the alien said, its mental voice carrying actual emotion for the first time. "The neural patterns are weaponized," Julia finished for it. "A little trick we learned during the Cold War. Amazing what the human brain can do with the right conditioning." The device exploded in a shower of sparks, and the force field holding Julia in place flickered and died. She was moving before it fully dissipated, decades of training taking over. The ceramic blade from her knitting basket, carefully designed to look like a measuring gauge, was in her hand and finding its mark before the aliens could react. The smallest alien went down first, black fluid seeping from where the blade had found what passed for its carotid artery. The second one managed to raise an alarm, but Julia was already in motion, her movements belying her apparent age. The third one tried to activate another device, but Julia's thrown blade interrupted that plan rather definitively. Alarms began to sound throughout the chamber, their pitch shifting in ways that made her teeth ache. Julia retrieved her blades and quickly began searching the aliens' bodies, her movements efficient and practiced. Their technology was advanced, but some principles were universal. She found what she was looking for on the smallest alien, a device that looked remarkably like a key card. Now, Julia muttered to herself as she approached one of the pulsing walls, let's see about finding Tom and getting some answers. Meanwhile, in his own chamber, Tom was putting on quite a show of being a frightened elderly man. He trembled at the right moments, pleaded appropriately, and generally gave his alien captors no reason to suspect he was anything other than a terrified human specimen. The fact that he had dislocated his thumb and was slowly working his way out of his restraints was, he felt, entirely beside the point. His aliens, he had 4 attending him, were particularly interested in his cardiovascular system. Their devices kept scanning his heart, producing holographic images that seemed to confuse them. The arterial reinforcement is inconsistent with normal human physiological development, one of them noted. And these traces of synthetic materials. I had a heart attack 10 years ago, Tom offered helpfully, his voice quavering. They put in some stents. It wasn't entirely a lie. The experimental cardiovascular enhancement surgery he'd undergone in '84 had involved stents, among other things. Primitive medical intervention would not account for these readings, another alien said. The molecular structure suggests far more advanced. The alien never finished its observation. The alarms that suddenly blared through the chamber drew all their attention, and Tom allowed himself a small smile. Right on schedule. Security breach in Sector 7, a voice announced in their heads. Subject compromise. Containment protocols. The message cut off in a burst of static. Tom's smile widened. Julia had always been good with communication systems, regardless of their origin. The aliens in his chamber began moving with increased urgency, their movements less precise, more hurried. Tom could practically smell their anxiety. One of them approached him with a device that looked decidedly unpleasant. We must accelerate the extraction, it said. The specimen's neural patterns must be preserved before . The chamber plunged into darkness, the bioluminescent walls going dark all at once. When the emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, casting everything in a deep red glow, Tom was no longer restrained. You know, he said, standing slowly and rolling his shoulders, in our line of work, we had a saying. He picked up his cane, which they had foolishly left within reach, believing it to be nothing more than a mobility aid. Always have an exit strategy. The first alien went down to a precisely placed strike to what passed for its knee joint. The second caught the cane across its elongated throat as Tom spun it with the skill of a master staff fighter. The third managed to activate some sort of energy weapon, but Tom was already inside its guard, the reinforced titanium of his cane proving remarkably effective against alien bone structure. The fourth alien backed away, its skin cycling through colors rapidly. You are not possible, it said. You are primitive. Weak. Your species is . Currently kicking your ass, Tom finished for it, before demonstrating exactly how primitive he could be with nothing but a weaponized walking aid and 60 years of combat experience. When the last alien fell, Tom quickly searched the chamber for anything useful. He found several devices that looked promising, including one that seemed to be some sort of communication tool. Following decades of practiced paranoia, he also made sure each of his alien captors was thoroughly incapacitated. No rookie mistakes, not even on an alien spaceship. The red emergency lighting cast strange shadows as he made his way to the chamber's entrance. The door, which had appeared seamless when he was brought in, now showed clear seams in its surface. Tom studied it for a moment, then smiled as he heard a familiar pattern of taps from the other side. You're late, he said as the door slid open to reveal Julia, looking as composed as ever despite the black alien blood staining her cardigan. Traffic was terrible, she replied, stepping over an unconscious or dead alien in the corridor. Did you get anything useful from yours before they went down? Tom held up the communication device he'd acquired. Possibly. You. Julia showed him the key card she'd taken. Definitely. Also, I think I know what they're really doing here. Her expression was grim. Tom, this isn't just about studying us. They're harvesting something from human neural patterns. Something they need. How many? Over 600 couples in this cycle alone. Going back 50 years. Julia's eyes met his, and he saw the same cold anger there that had driven them through some of their darkest missions. We need to end this. Tom nodded, falling into step beside her as they moved through the corridor. Just like old times. Just like old times, Julia agreed. Though I have to say, aliens are new. Usually, it was just corrupt governments and terrorist cells. Speaking of which, Tom said as they approached an intersection, any idea how big this ship is? Julia held up her stolen key card to a panel on the wall, and a holographic display appeared. Big enough that we're going to need help. She pointed to a section of the ship labeled in alien script that somehow translated in their minds. Look at this. They're keeping some of their subjects in stasis. Recently acquired ones, I think. Tom studied the display, years of tactical planning kicking in automatically. How many? Dozens, at least. Possibly more. Julia's fingers moved over the display, bringing up more information. If we can revive them. We'll have chaos, Tom finished. Multiple points of confusion, scattered resistance. Just the way we like it. Julia smiled, and it was the smile that had once made hardened killers take a step back. Shall we go liberate some fellow abductees? Tom checked his cane for damage. The titanium core had held up admirably against alien physiology, and returned her smile. Lead the way, partner. As they moved deeper into the alien vessel, both of them fell naturally into the rhythms and patterns that had served them so well during their operative years. They moved in perfect sync, covering angles, watching shadows, communicating with the subtle gestures and expressions that had been part of their shared language for decades. They were no longer retired farmers enjoying their golden years. They were ghosts, shadows, the kind of operators that had inspired whispered legends in intelligence communities around the world. And they were about to show their alien captors exactly why taking them had been a catastrophic mistake. The revelation. The stasis chamber stretched before them like a macabre art gallery, hundreds of transparent pods arranged in neat rows, each containing a suspended human form. Tom and Julia moved silently through the space, their footsteps absorbed by the strange, organic flooring that seemed to characterize the alien vessel. Reading anything familiar? Tom asked, gesturing to Julia's wedding ring. The seemingly simple gold band contained a sophisticated sensor suite, a parting gift from their old agency's tech division. Julia studied the readout visible only to her through a subdermal optical implant in her left eye. Electromagnetic signatures are off the charts. Whatever's keeping them suspended, it's like nothing in our database. She paused by one of the pods, her expression hardening. Tom, look at this one. Inside the pod was a young couple, probably in their early 30s. Their faces were peaceful, as if in deep sleep, but what caught Tom's attention was their clothing, tactical gear, partially concealed under civilian clothes. Operators, he said quietly. Like us. Julia nodded. Which means we're not the first ones to put up a fight. Question is, what happened to the others who resisted? Before Tom could respond, a new alarm began to sound, different from the earlier security alerts. This one was deeper, more resonant, and seemed to make the very air vibrate. Warning, the translated voice echoed in their heads. Neural harvest cycle initiating in Sector 12. All non-essential personnel clear the area. They shared a look. Sector 12. Tom asked. Julia brought up the holographic map using their stolen key card. 2 levels down. Large chamber. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the layout. Tom, the power readings there are massive. Sounds like we found their processing center. Tom adjusted his grip on his cane. How many do you think we can revive safely? Julia was already moving to the nearest control panel, her fingers dancing over the alien interface with practiced ease. The stasis field appears to be centrally controlled. If I can isolate this section and initiate a gradual revival sequence. She trailed off as she worked, and Tom took up a defensive position, watching both entrances to the chamber. How long? 5 minutes for the first wave. Maybe 20 pods. She glanced up at him. Some of them might not be in good shape. Tom nodded grimly. We'll deal with that when dash. The rest of his sentence was cut off by a new voice, one that didn't come through their neural translation. Step away from the control panel. The voice was human, American, with a slight southern drawl. Slowly. Tom and Julia turned to find a man emerging from the shadows between the pods. He was elderly, like them, but moved with the same careful precision that marked him as one of their own. He held what appeared to be a modified alien weapon, and his eyes held the hard look of someone who had seen too much. Colonel James Morrison, the man said, keeping the weapon trained on them. Or I was, before all this. You're the ones causing all the commotion upstairs. Julia's eyes narrowed slightly. Morrison. 7th Special Operations Group. The man's weapon dipped slightly. You know the unit? We did some joint ops in '83, Tom said carefully. Tehran. The embassy situation. Morrison studied them for a long moment, then lowered his weapon completely. Harvey, he said finally. Tom and Julia Harvey. You're the ones who got out. Went civilian. Tried to, Julia corrected, turning back to the control panel. How long have you been here, Colonel? Lost track. Weeks, maybe months. Morrison moved closer, his movements betraying old injuries. They took Sarah and me right out of our vacation home in Florida. Been playing their game, learning their patterns, waiting for a chance. He gestured to the pods. They keep bringing in more. Every night, more disappear from Earth. What happens in Sector 12? Tom asked. Morrison's face darkened. Nothing good. They harvest something. From our minds. Our consciousness, our experiences. They hook people up to their machines and... He shook his head. The bodies they return are empty. Shells. How many have you seen them process? Julia's fingers never stopped moving over the controls. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Morrison's voice was heavy. Sarah, she was taken there 3 days ago. I've been trying to find a way in, but the security is too tight. Whatever they're doing down there, it's important to them. A soft hum began to emanate from the nearest pods, and the opacity of the stasis field began to decrease. First wave is starting, Julia announced. 23 pods in this section. Colonel, we could use your help managing them as they wake up. Morrison nodded, falling easily back into a command role. What's the play here? We need to understand what they're really doing, Tom said, moving to the first pod as its occupant began to stir. And then we need to shut it down. Permanently. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos as they helped disorientated couples emerge from stasis. As Julia had predicted, some were in better shape than others. A few, like the tactical couple they'd spotted earlier, came out fighting. Others were confused, terrified, but all of them shared one thing, a burning desire to understand what had happened to them. Listen up, Morrison addressed the gathered group, his command voice cutting through the confusion. You've all been abducted by a non-terrestrial force. Yes, aliens. Yes, this is really happening. And yes, we have a chance to fight back, but only if we work together. Who are you people? One of the tactical operators asked, his training evident in how he had automatically taken up a defensive position near his partner. We're the ones who've been fighting them, Julia said simply. And now we need your help to end this. A woman in her 40s, wearing what had once been business attire, stepped forward. Dr. Sarah Chen, she introduced herself. Was a neurologist at Johns Hopkins. Before they took us. She gestured to her husband, a tall man who hadn't left her side. Whatever these beings are doing, it's sophisticated. They're not just studying us. They're extracting something. Can you elaborate? Julia asked. Dr. Chen's eyes grew distant. They had me in some kind of scanning chamber before they put us in stasis. The technology they were using, it wasn't focused on our physical brain structure. They were mapping conscious experience itself. Memories, emotions, learned behaviors. The harvest, Morrison said grimly. That's what they call it. Tom and Julia exchanged a look. The neural patterns they were so interested in, Julia mused. They're not just studying them. They're collecting them, Tom finished. But why? What could they possibly need with human consciousness? Before anyone could respond, the ship structure seemed to shudder around them. The lighting flickered, and for a moment, the ever-present hum of the vessel's systems changed pitch. Warning, the translated voice announced. Power fluctuation in neural processing center. Harvest cycle interrupted. Attempting to stabilize. They're having problems, Julia said, studying the readouts on her ring. Whatever they're doing down there, it's drawing massive amounts of power. Dr. Chen's eyes widened suddenly. Of course, she whispered. They're dying. All eyes turned to her. What do you mean? Morrison demanded. Think about it, she said, her scientific training evident in her precise explanation. Their technology, their ship, it's all biomechanical. Living technology. But what we've seen of them, their actual bodies. She gestured to the ship around them. They're dying out. Their consciousness, their ability to maintain their own neural patterns, it's failing. They're harvesting human consciousness to sustain themselves. The implications hit everyone at once. Tom's grip tightened on his cane. They're not just studying us. They're farming us, Julia finished, her voice cold. Using human consciousness to keep themselves alive. Morrison's face was grim. How many, he asked Dr. Chen. How many human minds would it take to sustain one of them? Based on the power readings and what I saw of their technology. She did some quick calculations in her head. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. And it wouldn't be permanent. They'd need a constant supply. Which explains the 50 years of abductions, Tom said. They're not just taking people randomly. They're maintaining a steady supply of human consciousness to sustain their species. Another tremor ran through the ship, stronger this time. The lights flickered again, and several displays on the walls began showing what appeared to be warning symbols. Whatever's happening in Sector 12, it's getting worse, Julia observed. We need to move now. Agreed, Morrison said. But we need a plan. We can't just charge in there. Tom looked at the gathered group, trained operators, civilians, people from all walks of life, all with skills and knowledge that could be useful. First, we need to understand their security patterns. Dr. Chen, what can you tell us about their neural technology? As the group began to plan, Julia moved closer to Tom. Just like Bucharest, she murmured. Tom smiled slightly, remembering the operation where they'd organized a prison uprising to cover their real mission. Better odds this time, he replied quietly. At least these people aren't hardened criminals. No, Julia agreed, watching as Morrison and Dr. Chen began organizing the others into teams based on their skills and experience. There's something better. They're people fighting for their lives. The ship shuddered again, and the translated voice returned, this time with an edge of what sounded almost like panic. Warning. Neural decay rate exceeding preservation threshold. Emergency harvest protocol initiated. Time's up, Morrison announced. They're getting desperate. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be now. Tom and Julia shared one final look, the kind that had preceded some of their most dangerous missions. In it was everything they didn't need to say, their love, their trust, their absolute confidence in each other's abilities. "Well," Tom said, addressing the group, "who's ready to teach some aliens why you don't mess with Earth?" The response was unanimous. As they began to move out, organizing into tactical teams with the efficiency of people who had nothing left to lose, Tom couldn't help but think that their retirement had been nice while it lasted. But some things were worth coming out of retirement for. The uprising. The descent to Sector 12 was like nothing Tom and Julia had experienced in their decades of covert operations. The ship's corridors seemed to pulse with increasing urgency, the bioluminescent walls flickering in patterns that Dr. Chen said indicated severe systemic stress. They moved in carefully coordinated teams, using formation patterns that blended military precision with civilian adaptability. The tactical couple, who had introduced themselves as Marcus and Sarah Rodriguez of Delta Force, took point with Morrison. Tom and Julia, along with Dr. Chen and her husband Michael, formed the Central Command Group. The remaining survivors spread out in supporting positions, armed with a mixture of stolen alien technology and improvised weapons. Reading massive power fluctuations ahead, Julia reported, her augmented eye scanning the ship's systems through her ring sensor suite. "Whatever they're doing down there, it's becoming unstable." "They're panicking," Dr. Chen observed, studying a neural interface panel they passed. "The neural decay rate in their systems is accelerating. They're losing their ability to maintain consciousness coherence." A violent tremor shook the corridor, stronger than any before. The lights dimmed momentarily, and when they came back up, they had shifted to a deep purple hue that made everyone's skin look bruised. "Emergency protocols initiated," the ship's translated voice announced. "All harvesters to primary processing chamber." "Repeat, all harvesters to primary processing chamber." "They're consolidating their forces," Morrison said grimly. "Preparing for a last stand." Tom shared a quick look with Julia. They'd seen this pattern before, desperate entities taking desperate measures. It rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Dr. Chen," Julia called softly. "You said their neural technology is biomechanical. How integrated is it with their consciousness?" The neurologist's eyes widened as she caught Julia's implication. "You think, yes, it's possible. Their entire ship is essentially an extension of their collective consciousness. That's why it's showing signs of stress as they deteriorate." "Then we're not just fighting them," Tom concluded. "We're fighting the ship itself." Before anyone could respond to that sobering thought, Marcus Rodriguez raised his fist in the universal signal for halt. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast chamber that defied human architectural understanding. The space seemed to bend in impossible ways, with multiple levels interconnected by streams of flowing energy that resembled liquid light. And in the center of it all was the harvesting machine. The device, if it could be called that, was a writhing mass of organic technology that reached from floor to ceiling like some mechanical Lovecraftian horror. Dozens of pods similar to the stasis chambers were connected to it by pulsing tendrils of light, and in each pod. "Sarah," Morrison whispered, his voice cracking as he spotted his wife's unconscious form in one of the pods. She wasn't alone. Each pod contained a human subject, their faces contorted in expressions of silent agony as glowing filaments extracted their neural patterns in visible streams of energy. Around the machine, at least 20 aliens worked at various control interfaces, their movements becoming increasingly erratic as they struggled to maintain the failing system. Their skin colors shifted rapidly, displaying patterns that Dr. Chen said indicated extreme distress. "The neural patterns are breaking down faster than they can process them," she explained, studying the energy flows. "They're trying to compensate by increasing the extraction rate, but it's killing the subjects more quickly." "How long do those people have?" Julia asked. Dr. Chen's expression was grim. "Minutes. Maybe less. Once the neural pattern is fully extracted, there's no going back. The body lives, but everything that made them who they were is gone. Tom did a quick tactical assessment. The chamber's layout was complex, with multiple levels offering both cover and exposure. The aliens were focused on their desperate work, but they had positioned guards at key points. A frontal assault would be suicide. "We need a distraction," he said. "Something big enough to draw their attention but controlled enough not to risk the pods." Julia's eyes gleamed with a familiar light. "Remember Minsk?" Tom smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "The Transformer Gambit?" "Julia, you're brilliant." He quickly outlined the plan to the others. It was risky, depending on precise timing and coordination between multiple teams, but it was their best shot at saving the harvesting victims. "Mr. Chen," Tom addressed the neurologist's husband, who had been quietly observing until now. "Dr. Chen mentioned you were an electrical engineer?" Michael Chen nodded. 30 years with Boeing's Advanced Systems Division. "If you're planning what I think you're planning, I can help modify the alien weapons to create the surge you'll need." Rodriguez team, you're with Morrison. Julia took over the tactical assignments. "Once we trigger the surge, you'll have 90 seconds to reach the upper level and secure those control stations. Dr. Chen, you and Michael will coordinate with Team 2 to access the primary neural interface. The rest of you, spread out and be ready to move on my signal. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore." As the teams moved into position, Tom and Julia found themselves alone for a moment. Around them, the chamber's energy patterns became increasingly chaotic, reflecting the aliens' deteriorating condition. "Quite a way to spend our retirement," Tom remarked, checking his improvised weapons one last time. Julia adjusted her ring settings to better track the energy fluctuations. "Well, you always said you wanted to travel more." "I was thinking more along the lines of Venice, maybe Paris." He paused, studying her face, the face he'd loved through decades of danger and peace. "Julia, if this goes wrong." She stopped him with a look that said everything they'd never needed words to express. "Together or not at all, partner. Just like always." The moment was interrupted by a sudden change in the chamber's energy pattern. The streams of neural energy began to pulse more rapidly, and the humans in the pod started to convulse. "They're accelerating the harvest." Dr. Chen's urgent whisper came through the improvised communication system they'd established. "We need to move now." Tom and Julia shared one final look, then moved into action. Decades of working together made words unnecessary as they executed their parts of the plan with flawless precision. Julia reached the lower level's primary power junction first, her fingers dancing over the alien interface with practiced ease. Tom covered her, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to take down 2 alien guards with his modified cane before they could raise an alarm. The first sign that their plan was working was a subtle change in the chamber's background hum. The flowing energy streams began to flicker, their patterns becoming erratic. "Warning," the ship's voice announced, genuine alarm now evident in its translated tone. "Critical power fluctuation detected. Neural stability compromised. Emergency protocols." The message cut off in a burst of static as Julia completed her modifications. The surge she created wasn't large enough to damage the critical systems keeping the humans alive, but it played havoc with the aliens' neural interfaces. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The aliens nearest the harvesting machine stumbled, their movements becoming uncoordinated as their connection to their technology was disrupted. Several collapsed entirely, their consciousness presumably too dependent on the ship's systems to function independently. "Now." Tom's command triggered a coordinated assault that would have made their old special operations commanders proud. The Rodriguez team, moving with Delta Force precision, secured the upper level in exactly the predicted 90 seconds. Morrison, driven by desperate determination, fought his way to his wife's pod with a ferocity that belied his age. Dr. Chen and her husband reached the primary neural interface just as the aliens began to recover from the initial disruption. Working with incredible speed, they began the delicate process of disconnecting the harvesting victims without causing further neural damage. But the aliens weren't finished. Those that remained standing began to merge with their technology in ways that defied human comprehension. Their forms elongated, twisted, became one with the machine until it was impossible to tell where alien ended and technology began. "They're integrating directly with the harvesting system," Dr. Chen reported, her voice tense as she worked. "Trying to bypass the damaged interfaces." "How many can you save?" Julia asked, fighting off a tendril of living metal that tried to wrap around her arm. "We've stabilized about half," Michael Chen replied. "But the others, the neural extraction is too far advanced." Tom, who had made his way to the central platform, found himself facing what appeared to be the alien leader, now a grotesque fusion of biological and technological components. Its black eyes had multiplied, covering most of what had been its head, and its voice when it spoke resonated through both their minds and the ship's structure. "You cannot understand what you are destroying," it said. "We are the last. The final repository of countless civilizations' consciousness. Without us, all that knowledge, all that experience, will be lost." "You're parasites," Tom replied, dodging a whip-like appendage that cracked the platform where he had been standing. "Stealing other beings' consciousness to preserve yourselves." "We are preservers," the alien leader insisted. "Each consciousness we harvest becomes part of our collective memory, living on through us." "Living as slaves," Julia countered, appearing on the platform's other side. She had acquired one of the alien energy weapons and wielded it with deadly accuracy. "Trapped in your dying minds." The chamber shuddered violently as the aliens' desperate attempt to maintain control began to tear their systems apart. Energy discharges crackled through the air, and the harvesting machine's writhing tendrils became increasingly frenzied. "Dr. Chen." Tom called out as he narrowly avoided another attack. "Status. 60% of the victims stabilized and disconnected," she reported. "But the system's becoming unstable. If those energy patterns collapse all at once." She didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what a catastrophic neural feedback loop could do to an organic brain. The alien leader, its form now almost completely merged with the harvesting machine, raised what might have been arms toward the ceiling. "If we cannot have your consciousness," it declared, "then none shall survive." Initiating final protocol. The chamber's energy patterns shifted again, but this time there was something different about them. Something terminal. "They're overloading the entire neural network," Dr. Chen shouted. "They're going to burn out everyone's consciousness, theirs and ours." Tom and Julia shared a look across the platform, and in that moment, they both knew what had to be done. It was the kind of decision they'd faced before, in other places, in other lives, when the only options were bad and worse. "Together?" Julia asked, already moving into position. Tom nodded, understanding her plan without need for explanation. "Together." The reckoning. The harvesting chamber had become a maelstrom of energy and chaos. Streams of neural energy crackled through the air like lightning, their patterns growing increasingly erratic as the alien collective's desperate gambit threatened to destroy everything, themselves, their victims, and their would-be rescuers. But Tom and Julia Harvey had faced impossible odds before. They moved in perfect synchronization, decades of partnership allowing them to execute their plan without a word between them. As they approached the central core of the harvesting machine from opposite directions, their movements mirrored each other with deadly precision. "What are they doing?" Morrison called from the upper level, where he cradled his newly freed wife's unconscious form. Dr. Chen, still working frantically at the neural interface with her husband, looked up just long enough to analyze their movements. Her eyes widened in sudden understanding. "They're going to invert the neural feed," she breathed. "Use the aliens' own technology against them." The alien leader, now more machine than biological entity, seemed to realize their intention. Its multiple black eyes focused on the approaching couple, and tendrils of living metal lashed out in desperate attempts to stop them. You cannot comprehend what you are destroying, it boomed, its voice resonating through both their minds and the ship's structure. We are the culmination of 1,000,000 years of evolution. The final repository of countless species' collected wisdom. No, Julia replied, dodging a tendril while maintaining her course. You're afraid. Afraid of dying, afraid of losing your power. Afraid of facing the end that comes to all living things. Tom, moving steadily from the other direction, added his own observation. You stopped evolving when you started stealing other species' consciousness to preserve yourselves. You're not the pinnacle of evolution, you're its dead end. The alien collective's response was a horrific screech that manifested both audibly and mentally, causing several of the rescued humans to clutch their heads in pain. The harvesting machine's tendrils began moving with renewed frenzy, and the neural energy streams intensified to near-blinding levels. Warning, the ship's voice announced, now clearly destabilizing. Critical neural cascade imminent. All systems failing. Emergency protocols offline. Dr. Chen. Julia called out as she reached her position near the core. How many are still connected? 37 pods still active, the neurologist reported grimly. We can't disconnect them fast enough, and the feedback loop is building. Tom reached his position opposite Julia, their locations forming perfect counterpoints around the harvesting machine's core. Then we do this now. The alien leader's form writhed as it realized what they intended. You will die. Your consciousness will be destroyed along with ours. Maybe, Julia acknowledged, her hands moving over the neural interface she'd reached. But we'll die free. Tom's fingers danced across his own interface, inputting the commands they'd developed. Ready, partner. Julia's smile was fierce and beautiful, the same smile he'd fallen in love with decades ago in a safe house in Berlin. Always. Together, they initiated the sequence that would change everything. The principle was simple. Dr. Chen had explained how the aliens' neural technology worked by creating a one-way flow of consciousness, from victim to collector. Tom and Julia's plan was to reverse that flow, to force the aliens' collected consciousness back through their own system. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The neural energy streams reversed direction with explosive force. The alien collective screamed as billions of stored consciousness patterns suddenly flooded back through their neural network. It was too much, too fast, too chaotic to process. They're trying to shut it down. Dr. Chen shouted over the rising chaos. The feedback loop is dash. Her words were cut off as the harvesting machine began to implode. The reversal had created a cascade effect, overloading the aliens' ability to process neural patterns. Their technology, so dependent on the steady flow of stolen consciousness, couldn't handle the sudden reversal. But Tom and Julia weren't finished. As the system began to collapse, they initiated the second phase of their plan. Now, Michael. Julia commanded. Dr. Chen's husband, still at the primary interface, executed the program they'd prepared. The ship's own neural network began to reconfigure, creating new pathways for the consciousness energy to flow. It's working, he reported. The patterns are stabilizing, redirecting to the empty pods. The alien leader, its form now fracturing as its consciousness began to fragment, realized too late what they had done. They hadn't just reversed the flow, they had created a new destination for the released neural patterns. The pods. Morrison called out in amazement. They're receiving the patterns. Dr. Chen's fingers flew over her interface, monitoring the process. The empty pods are acting as temporary storage, catching the released consciousness patterns before they can dissipate. The neural signatures, they're reorganizing themselves. The harvesting chamber had become a storm of light and energy, but now there was purpose to the chaos. The reversed flow of neural energy was being channeled, directed, saved rather than destroyed. But the price was steep. Tom and Julia stood at their positions, hands locked onto their interfaces, acting as human conductors for the massive energy transfer. The strain on their bodies was evident, their faces were drawn with pain, their forms literally glowing with the neural energy passing through them. "Tom! Julia!" Morrison shouted. "You have to let go. The feedback will kill you." "Can't," Tom gritted out. "Have to, maintain the flow, until it's complete." Julia's voice was equally strained but determined. "Almost, there." The alien collective was dissolving now, their stolen consciousness torn away from them, their own patterns unable to maintain coherence without their harvested neural energy. The leader's multiple eyes began to dim as its form collapsed in on itself. "You, doom yourselves," it gasped out. "The knowledge, will be lost." "No," Julia managed to respond. "It will be, returned. To those, you stole it from." The chamber shuddered violently as the process reached its crescendo. The aliens' forms dissolved completely, reduced to inert organic matter as their consciousness patterns were either destroyed or redistributed. The harvesting machine, no longer sustained by their neural energy, began to collapse. "Neural transfer at 98%. Michael-chan reported. "But the system's failing. We need to evacuate." Morrison took charge of the evacuation, coordinating with the Rodriguez team to begin moving the occupied pods. The rescued victims who were able to walk helped carry those who couldn't. But Tom and Julia remained at their posts. "You have to come now," Dr. Chen pleaded. "The chamber's going to collapse." Julia looked across the space at Tom, their eyes meeting one last time. In that look was a lifetime of love, of partnership, of shared purpose. "Go," Tom ordered the others. "Get them to safety. All of them." But Morrison started to protest. "That's an order, Colonel," Julia said firmly. "Complete the mission. Save the others." Dr. Chen understood first. "You're maintaining the neural stability," she said quietly. "If you let go before the transfer is complete, all those consciousness patterns will be lost," Tom confirmed. "We can hold it together long enough to get everyone out. But you'll be caught in the collapse," Michael-chan warned. Julia's smile was serene despite the strain evident on her face. "We've had a good run. Longer than most in our line of work. And this," Tom added, "this is worth it." The chamber's structure was beginning to fail as the ship's neural network collapsed. The walls themselves were dissolving, the bioluminescent patterns fading into darkness. "Go," Julia commanded. "Now." The others had no choice. As Morrison led the evacuation, carrying his still unconscious wife, he looked back one last time at the two figures standing like anchors in the storm of neural energy. The last thing he saw before the chamber entrance sealed was Tom and Julia reaching toward each other across the space, their free hands clasped together as the world dissolved around them. The evacuation was completed just in time. The survivors, led by Morrison and the Chens, managed to reach the ship's escape pods moments before the vessel's structural integrity failed completely. They watched from a safe distance as the massive alien craft imploded, collapsing in on itself until nothing remained but scattered debris falling through Earth's atmosphere like shooting stars. In the end, they saved 243 people. Men and women who had been taken over the past months, their consciousness nearly stolen, were restored to their bodies. Many would need time to recover, to process their experience, but they were alive. They were themselves. The official story, carefully crafted by Morrison and others who understood the need for discretion, blamed the disappearances on a complex human trafficking operation. Families were reunited, lives were rebuilt, and the world continued turning, unaware of how close it had come to becoming a consciousness farm for a dying alien race. But in certain circles, among those who knew the truth, the story was told differently. They spoke of two retired operators who had faced down an alien invasion with nothing but decades of experience and unshakable love for each other. Who had, in their final act, transformed a torture chamber into a path to salvation. 1 month after the event, Morrison stood in front of a simple marker placed in a quiet corner of Arlington National Cemetery. It bore no dates, no explanation, just 2 names and a simple inscription. Tom and Julia Harvey. Together or not at all. He placed 2 small glasses of lemonade at the base of the marker, then stepped back and saluted. "Rest easy, you magnificent bastards," he said softly. Mission accomplished. Above him, the night sky was clear and beautiful. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that the fireflies dancing among the tombstones seemed to flicker in patterns that looked almost like code. Just another quiet night in a world that would never know how close it had come to losing its soul, or how much it owed to 2 retired operators who had traded their golden years for one last, crucial mission. Together, as always, until the very end.